So we're going to go ahead and get started now. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining the DC Preservation League this morning for our second program in the Stewardship for Climate Action series that will focus on DC's Climate Action Plan and how the Department of Energy, Environment, and Office of Planning are implementing these efforts. My name is Rebecca Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. I am joined by my colleagues, Kelly Knox, Zachary Burt, and Melissa Laureano, and Shay Corey, who are monitoring your questions, both on the webinar Q&A and chat section and on Facebook. Questions will be answered during the facilitated discussion after our last presentation of the morning. For those of you who are seeking AIA continuing education credits, please email me at rebecca@dcpreservation.org for more information on reporting your attendance. I'd like to start off by thanking the members, DCPL's members and sponsors. Excuse me, I apologize. A few of who are mentioned here on this slide. It's with their support that DCPL is able to continue to provide free and low-cost programs to the public like this one today. I'd also like to thank the planning committee that has taken its time to work together for the last 6 months to put together this fall programming series. I do thank you for your time and your commitment to this cause. And we're looking at the list of those who are joining us today, and there were quite a few new names. So I'd like to just start off for those of you who are not familiar with the DC Preservation League, just to tell you a little bit about ourselves. We are the citywide nonprofit that's fully dedicated to advocating for the preservation and protection of our city's irreplaceable historic resources. DCPL was founded in 1971 to save the old post office building on Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's credited with advocating for the protection of hundreds of individually designated sites and thousands of buildings within historic districts. As part of our 50th anniversary this year, the DCPL Board of Trustees has focused the organization's education and outreach efforts on 3 main themes. These include historic preservation's role in the planning process, diverse stories, which is focused on honoring DC's culturally diverse and diverse past, and finally, sustainability, which explores how the preservation and adaptive reuse of old and historic buildings can be a major tool in DC's climate action efforts. DCPL was founded during the infancy of the environmental movement, and the organization remains committed to partnering with our city and community partners as we all work towards a culturally and environmentally sustainable and resilient city. So with that, I'd like to now take a moment to introduce the Stewardship for Climate Action's Program Chair, Carl Elefante. Carl is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and the Association for Preservation Technology, and a principal emeritus with Quinn Architects, where he served as design principal on architecture, historic preservation, and community revitalization projects. Known for coining the phrase, "the greenest building is one that is already built," Carl writes and lectures internationally on historic preservation, sustainable design, climate change, and urban topics. As I mentioned, Carl is a senior fellow with Architecture 2030, working to advance building sector decarbonization globally, and is a founding member of the Climate Heritage Network, which promotes the value of cultural heritage in curtailing climate change, and an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of America and the University of Maryland. Carl also served in 2018 as the 94th president of the American Institute of Architects. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Carl for his presentation.
Thank you, Rebecca. This is program 2 in our 6-part series. When Rebecca first got in touch and we talked about, really what would be the best topic to address as we really tried to understand how sustainability and historic preservation were working together here in 2021, became clear very quickly that we should focus on climate action. So here we are, program number 2, where we'll concentrate on really trying to understand what the DC Climate Action Plan is, from the horse's mouth, so to speak, with getting our understanding from DC staff about what it's all about. Our last program was really laying the baseline. In the future, we'll have programs that are addressing retrofit examples, renewable energy, embodied and avoided carbon. And then our last program will sort of tie it all together with strong and resilient programs. So just a couple of introductory comments here. Clearly what we're doing today goes back to a really important threshold moment in 2015 when the Paris Agreement on Climate Change was signed. In a couple of weeks, the COP26 will be being held in Glasgow, Scotland, the 5-year check-in on the Paris Agreement, which of course is happening 6 years later because of the pandemic. And even in just this short period of time, we understand that the goals that were established in Paris are insufficient and that it's really necessary to just ramp up our ambitions and then also accelerate our climate action. So what we're talking about today is extremely important, and what we'll hear about in terms of the district's commitments to climate change. There's even more pressure than there was 5 years ago to really be effective in this work. We do this in the context of understanding that climate change is not happening in a vacuum, and that in fact there are many really important and intransigent social, economic, and environmental issues that are interlocking with it and that are of equal importance to keep in mind as we look at what decarbonizing the world and decarbonizing the building sector in specific will mean. Kind of top of mind for me is the Habitat 3 summit that took place in Quito, Ecuador in 2016, where I'll call it the Declaration of the Urban Century was made. So at the beginning of the 21st century, for the first time in human history, more than half of global population lives in cities. The UN estimates that by the end of the century, nearly 9 in 10 people will. Next slide, please. This was also then in conjunction with the UN General Assembly adopting these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And long story short about the SDGs is that these really do articulate those intransigent social, economic, and environmental issues that are related to every aspect of sustainable development and climate action today. Next slide, please. I just wanted to also put a little bit of an exclamation point about how deeply involved the heritage community and also arts and cultural communities are getting in what is easy to sort of look at only a kind of a technical issue, which is climate change and decarbonization. And it's far beyond a technical issue. When we go to COP26 for the first 2 weeks in November, arts and culture and heritage organizations will be extremely involved. And I'll note that our own Andrew Potts, who has been a historic preservation attorney here in Washington for many years, is a really key player in bringing heritage issues up to the international level of climate change consideration. So our heritage community is a really, really important stakeholder in climate change. Next slide, please. Just want to say 2 quick things about that relationship of our concerns about heritage stewards and what climate change means to us. The first is that climate change is threatening and in fact destroying heritage buildings. These 4 photographs are unfortunately getting to be something that we see in the papers every day. The bottom 2, which is Sunny Day flooding in Annapolis, Maryland, where it's flooding because the tides are higher than they've ever been before without any rain events or anything like that. The bottom right, which is the second 1,000-year storm that took place in Ellicott City within a 5-year span. If you get 2 of them in a 5-year span, I don't think they're 1,000-year storms anymore. And this is happening to our heritage building stock as we speak. Next slide, please. The other thing to appreciate about heritage buildings is that most of them are occupied living buildings. what that means, unfortunately, is that we're also part of the problem, that heritage buildings are creating part of the climate footprint that we're trying to solve here. Our buildings are emitting greenhouse gases, both operationally and embodied energy as well. And therefore, we're part of the problem. We have to be part of the solution. Next slide, please. So in program one, we tried to lay a kind of a little bit of a theoretical and then also statistical baseline for this. We had 4 speakers who joined us, Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullerlove from the New School, Dr. Gregory Swires from George Washington University, and then also Brian Kraft and Sarah Vonish, who really brought mapping skills, and then also just a really great overview of the history of the development of Washington to us. Next slide, please. Mindy, who is a very, very well-recognized author on the kind of social and cultural dimensions of the built environment and also the challenges to the built environment, including climate change, really reminded us about how important the environment that we live in is, how much it affects us as people, how much it gives us an opportunity as people to express ourselves, and how much it either facilitates the futures we want or really acts as barriers to the futures that we want. Next slide, please. Greg Squires spent quite an eye-opening presentation on really helping us understand the built-in inequities in our built environment and in our city environments. And that I would say that he made it clear that our understanding today and our goals today are kind of very confused. Do we really understand what we're trying to do to move to an effective version of an equity equation where everyone gets what they need in the city? And he also kind of mapped out some of the inequities, in fact, right here in Washington that you can see in mapping exercises. Next slide, please. And then Brian and Sarah went through just an amazing history of the development of Washington over time, helped us realize the unusual aspect of it, of being a city that was actually designed to a plan. And then how that plan, of course, evolved organically as the city grew beyond the original plan, and also just went from being an idea of what the seat of government would look like to a living, breathing city. Next slide, please. And relating both the mapping development, where the city grew when, but also really helping us understand how the character of the city has evolved over 200 years. And in fact, very much bringing us to the present, and how dynamically the city continues to develop today. So that's a little bit of an overview of kind of where we were with program one, and brings us to where we are today. Next slide, please. So to really start program two, I want to begin by saying we here in the District of Columbia live in an extraordinary place, and we all know that and appreciate it in a number of different ways in our personal lives. But on this topic of climate action, I can tell you with some authority that globally, the District of Columbia is really looked at as a leader on trying to bring its resources together as a community to address in every way it can on the local level its responsibility to respond to climate action. And we're going to hear a lot about that today. There's many dimensions to it. We have many reasons to really be proud about how DC has worked over now really many years to try to position itself to be doing what it needs to be doing, and doing it as quickly as can possibly do it, to be launching climate action, and to be doing it in the context of a real community and understanding what the issues of this multifaceted real community is. Next, please. So today we have a panel of the people that are actually getting it done. These are all people that work for us in the District of Columbia government. We have 3 representatives from the DC Office of Planning, Rogelio Flores, Stephen Geyer, and Amania Price, and we'll introduce them more in a minute. And then later we'll be joined also by 2 staffers from the District of Office of Energy and Environment, Casey Studweiler and Katie Bergfield. And so we're going to, as I said before, really hear it from the people that are putting these programs together and really helping by having the public sector lay the groundwork for what private sector actors need to do in order to address climate change. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Carl. That was a great overview of the first presentation. For those of you who were not able to join us for the first program, it is available in full on DCPL's YouTube channel and on DCPL's website at dcpreservation.org. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rogelio Flores and Stephen Geyer from the DC Office of Planning. Rogelio is the Associate Director for the City Planning Strategy and Analysis Division of DCOP. In his role, he leads initiatives that shape dynamic, inclusive, and equitable change in our nation's capital. He oversees land use, transportation, capital facilities, housing, and economic development strategies, and long-range planning for the agency. He brings nearly 20 years of experience to this role, joining OP in 2016 as a senior planner of capital facilities, working on large-scale projects, as well as the Comprehensive Plan Update Program and Capital Improvement Plan, the CIP. Before that, he served the City of Los Angeles Department of City Planning for 8 years, managing multiple teams and an extensive portfolio of city-making initiatives across all scales and levels of planning and development. He previously also served in senior roles for a tech startup and philanthropic sectors in New York City, and as a university campus planner in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He has an urban planning degree and a master's degree from Harvard Graduate School of Design, and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering Sciences from the University of Florida, where he was also a Ronald E. McNair Fellow in Social Sciences. Rogelio will speak first, and then followed by Stephen Geyer, who currently serves as the Senior Sustainability Planner for the District of Columbia Office of Planning. And he is responsible for formulating sustainability and resilience policies relating to environmental protection, parks and open space, and public health. Previously, Stephen worked in OP's Development Review Division, where he evaluated projects for their adherence to the best planning, urban design, architecture, and sustainability practices. He earned a master's of city and regional planning from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a master's in business administration, a Bachelor of Arts of International Affairs, and a certificate in landscape design from George Washington University. So with that, I will turn it over to Rogelio to start us off.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Rebecca, Kelly, Carl, and the rest of the DC Preservation team for inviting OP to present as part of this very important series on stewardship for the Climate Action Program. Again, my name is Rogelio Flores, and I'm here with Stephen Geyer from OP. He serves as OP's lead sustainability planner. Importantly, there are going to be 2 presentations following this one, including one by our OP colleague, Amania Price. She is a historic preservation specialist. And also there will be a presentation from our colleagues, Katie Bergfield and Casey Studhalter from the district's Office of Energy and Environment. So with that, as an introduction, let's see here. Okay, so what does the Office of Planning do in DC? At a really high level, what OP does is we steward land use, zoning, historic preservation, and other really important tools that help to shape and guide the district's built environment, as well as the supportive systems in our city in a manner that advances racial equity, mobility, and housing opportunities for current residents, and that also accommodates future growth in both population and in jobs. One of the most significant challenges, of course, as we think of advancing these kinds of objectives, is doing that responsibly, particularly in relation to the impacts of climate change and the need to achieve net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. So during this short presentation, Steve and I are going to provide you with a very broad contour of these challenges, and then some examples of what OP is doing to address these types of challenges. So as we can see here, I think we're all well aware of a lot of challenges relating to climate change and in the district. In particular, precipitation, extreme weather, sea level rise are all impending, and in fact, some of these impacts we are already beginning to experience in the district, and as others will allude during the remainder of this presentation, these are becoming increasingly important areas for analysis, policy setting, as well as investment. Okay, so from OP's perspective, part of our role is to accommodate forecasted population growth, both in the midterm and in the longer term. And in this graphic, you can see the story of the population patterns of Washington, DC. As you can see, our population peaked at a little over 800,000 population in the 1940s, and then it declined through the 90s. We then reached an inflection point from 1998 to 2000, when the growth engine of the district was sort of revved and eventually throttled. Our tax revenues at that time increased significantly. The growth machine regionally was turned on, and our population locally went from about 560,000 to 680,000 in 2020. And we're then forecasted to grow, really importantly, to about 940,000 population by the year 2040. That's a growth of 38% for the district. And you can see that in the red dotted line. And interestingly enough, the slope matches the growth we saw in the 1930s to the 1950s. So why is this important in the context of climate change? I think, as we all know, humans, we're all carbon generators. We generate carbon through our activities, including the food that we eat, the goods and energy that we consume, the transportation choices that we make, and very importantly for OP, the kinds of locational and housing choices that we make. So growing our population by 260,000 residents in the next 20 years is definitely going to be a considerable challenge over the next 20 years with respect to overall carbon emissions, as well as preparing for to try to mitigate the effects of climate change. In addition, for OP, balancing climate change with growth, housing and racial equity are also very important priorities for the district. Addressing housing costs is also one of the big challenges. So growth is one challenge, and then of course addressing housing costs and the legacy, the racist legacy of a lot of federal policies over time in the district, as was the case in many other American cities through redlining and covenants and so forth. We are trying to address those kinds of issues head on. And to that end, Mayor Bowser in 2019 set bold targets for advancing housing affordability in 2019. And the goal is to produce 36,000 new market rate units by 2025, and 12,000 of those being affordable units. The reason this is furthers, I think, the district's equity agenda is, if you see on the left-hand map, you can see that we had a relative disproportional distribution of affordable housing units in 2018. And if you see the map on the right, we are trying to more proportionally and equitably distribute housing across the district. The underlying theory and empirical data that support this as a positive move forward for addressing equity is that research from Harvard and many other universities has shown that increasing housing production in high opportunity neighborhoods has a great effect, a positive effect in the lifelong public health, education, and income outcomes of the population. This is a really rapidly expanding field that some of you may have heard in relation to public health, called the social determinants of public health. So on this slide, you will see the affordable housing production goals for the year 2025 are considerable, and in particular in Rock Creek West. And then in the longer term, the recent comprehensive plan update set a goal of having 15%, a target rate of 15% minimum affordability across all the district's 10 city planning areas. So, as we have seen, housing and accommodating growth are really important priorities, and those do need to be harmonized with climate change preparations. So I now want to turn to OP's conceptual approach for how we can harmonize priorities in the context of systems that comprise the city. So on this graphic, you can see we tried to just posit our conceptual approach to scales in what we call scales and systems. On the y-axis, you can see the systems that from our perspective comprise a good extent of what comprises city planning and city life. And it includes things like, like transportation or economic life or sociocultural life, civic infrastructure, and so forth. And on the x-axis, you can see that we have different scales of analysis. So this grid really enables and has enabled OP to understand specific challenges along both spectrums and to then optimize solutions across various scales and across different systems. So Stephen and Imania will provide some examples, more concrete examples, later in this presentation. Importantly, while today's session focuses a lot on buildings, you can see in this chart that OP is looking at buildings as part of a much broader set of overlapping and interrelated systems that together comprise a range of human activities in our city. The system scales concept then enables us to understand trade-offs and opportunity costs at different scales, and for individual as well as collective systems. And also for different timescales. Likely we should probably add a z-axis to this chart to show there are also temporal trade-offs in terms of making investments now versus in the future, the location of different investments, and to better understand the impacts and the types of benefits reaped by different stakeholders depending on the system, the temporal scale, as well as the geographic scale. So this concept can also help and has helped inform development of equitable strategies and approaches to climate preparation and mitigation. And it has also helped us to inform our approach to the recent comprehensive plan update. As you may have heard, our council adopted a really significant update to our comprehensive plan in April of this year. And it's the first major update since 2006. And that will be covered in greater detail later in this presentation. So with that as context and sort of these competing tensions and priorities, and especially growth, housing affordability, racial equity, and then decarbonization and achieving net zero by the year 2050. These are really important overarching somewhat competing tensions, and the district, we're working very, very closely across agencies, and in particular OP and DOE working together to harmonize the approaches and make sure that as we move forward, we can achieve a really, really successful outcome for our stakeholders and for our climate future. So now I turn it over to Stephen Geyer, and I just want to note that unfortunately I'm not going to be able to stay on for the Q&A, but I leave you in great hands with Stephen and Mania and our DOE colleagues. Thank you. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Rogelio. Good morning, everyone. Thank you also to DCPL for having us this morning. I'm going to talk about, take what Rogelio has been talking about and bring it down in scale somewhat. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the family of plans. There have been several district efforts over the years to address climate change mitigation and adaptation through various lenses and at various scales. And here are a few of the plans and frameworks that DC government has produced over the recent years, from systems level approaches, including the comprehensive plan, sustainable DC, resilient DC, climate ready DC, to more specific ones, such as the Buzzard Point framework, the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative. Rogelio mentioned, he also mentioned the social determinants of health. And lately we've tried thinking about how climate change impacts community health. And this is really seen most explicitly in DC Health's Health Equity Report, which recognizes that climate change and chronic disease are interrelated. So we know that the health effects of climate change disruptions include increased respiratory and cardiovascular disease, injuries, and premature deaths related to extreme weather events, and also threats to mental health. So point is we're working diligently to make sure that these efforts are aligned and build on one another. The comprehensive plan is the district's overarching land use plan. The comprehensive plan is a high-level guide, and it sets a positive long-term vision for the physical development of the district. We know that the city will grow and change. That's a given. But the comprehensive plan is our 20-year framework that seeks to guide this future growth and development. The role of the comprehensive plan is, as it says, to help guide that change, but it's towards a positive future for today's residents and for our children and grandchildren. And notably, it establishes a context. It sets broad goals to inform public decision-making and fine-grained planning efforts. It really significantly informs the zoning regulations and also capital budgeting. So the comprehensive plan is a policy representation of the systems scale concept that Rogelio just showed you. And as you mentioned, we just updated the plan a few months ago. The original comp plan was released in 2006, and our thinking on several major themes has evolved over the years. I'm going to mention a few of these. Of course, COVID-19 recovery is a very recent development in our districts, in our life, but also I want to mention equity and racial justice. So we through the comp plan, we've set out nearly 100 policies and actions that will help ensure all residents have what they need to thrive, no matter their race, age, neighborhood, or income. And these policies are supported by important data and trends throughout the update that reflect these current disparities in areas like housing or job production. Second area I want to mention is resilience. And the comp plan introduces approaches to help us respond to both human-made and natural shocks and stressors, including displacement and other risks posed by climate change and public health emergencies. So we are, the district government is approaching climate change on 3 tracks: mitigation locally, adaptation locally, and demonstrated leadership nationally and globally, as Carl mentioned. So mitigation refers to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. Adaptation means adjusting to the impacts of climate change and doing so in a way that supports wider efforts to make Washington, D.C. healthier and more livable. So we're going to prepare for these potential shocks and stressors brought on by climate change through environmental and built environment approaches that provide multiple community benefits. And these solutions can include the conservation of the naturally protected features of environmental assets, or ecosystem services, the expansion of green infrastructure, and the inclusion of non-structural land uses such as parks in hazardous or environmentally sensitive locations. It also means designing buildings to be more responsive to threats posed by flooding and urban heat. So there are 25 elements or chapters in the comp plan, and it's divided into the citywide elements and the area elements. The citywide elements include system level policies and actions to address climate change, everything from environmental protection to parks, recreation, and open space to historic preservation. These policies and actions are then implemented through the 11 neighborhood elements at a place-based scale. OP has a critical role in resilience and climate change response. We're not a housing or environmental agency, but we have an impact on policy. So in addition to the 25 elements, there are two critical maps, the generalized policy map and the future land use map, or the FLUM. So these two key maps have relevance for our climate change policy because the future land use map depicts the intended land use for an area generally. It's not a zoning map, but it envisions uses for the horizon year of the comp plan. In this case, it's a 20-year plan. So we're envisioning what we will look like in 20 years. And we have used the future land use map, or the FLUM, to increase density around transit corridors. So this has implications for built form and therefore implications for our for emissions and our response to climate change. You know, for example, transit-oriented development, we know has a direct correlation with transportation emissions. And so how and where we designate open spaces will impact air quality, urban heat islands, and stormwater. And then, so the FLUM is divided into land use categories from low to high and across commercial, residential, and industrial uses. And it's of interest to anyone who wants to build anything in the district, as zoning must be in alignment with it. So speaking of emissions, the district has set a goal of achieving a 50% reduction in carbon emissions from the 2006 baseline, with the goal of completely cutting emissions by 2050. And according to this data provided by DOE, we are on pace to achieve our citywide emissions targets. However, achieving the remaining necessary reductions will require significant changes to our built environment, particularly our buildings. And that's because buildings are the source of most of the district's emissions, with commercial buildings comprising about 77% of emissions for that sector. The transportation sector, on the other hand, contributes a substantial, although much smaller amount of emissions. And Katie and Casey are going to talk more about how DOE is tackling emissions in the building sector later in the presentation. It also be noted that the district government is also tackling waste reduction to meet our emissions goals. So as Carl said, we don't plan in a vacuum, and climate change does not exist in a vacuum, and we can't do it alone. For example, our work to reduce greenhouse gases aligns with work in nearby jurisdictions. And as I previously mentioned, we have a goal in the comp plan of mitigating and adapting to climate change while being a leader nationally and internationally. The chart on the right shows some of the district's goals in comparison to Maryland and Virginia. And climate knows no boundaries. It's going to take a regional approach to tackle climate mitigation and adaptation. Simultaneously, and Raulio talked a bit about this, we are balancing other district priorities. He alluded to Mayor Bowser's housing equity report, which established critical bold steps for addressing housing affordability in the district. And the mayor has set a goal of 36,000 additional housing units in the district by 2025, of which 12,000 will be affordable housing units. And so if we are building more housing in the district, this will reduce the impact on transportation emissions, relieving environmental pressures. However, it should be noted that we cannot unilaterally increase the housing supply to satisfy overall demand in the region. Regionally, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments has set a goal of 240,000 affordable housing units in the district by 2025. The other key map in the comp plan is the generalized policy map. And the generalized policy map provides broad policy guidance to decision makers. It's essentially our roadmap for how we're going to plan in the next few years. It highlights areas where more detailed policies are necessary, both within the comp plan and follow-up plans in order to manage the change that we see. The generalized policy map provides guidance on whether areas are designated for conservation, enhancement, or change. So one example from the generalized policy map that I'm going to highlight are the resilience focus areas and RFAs. These are areas where future planning efforts are anticipated to ensure that resilience to flooding for new development and infrastructure projects, including capital projects, is resilient to climate change, especially in areas where, especially in the 100 and 500-year floodplains. So these areas are, for the most part, located along the Anacostia and Potomac rivers, although there are some tributaries included, such as the Watts Branch area. The RFAs include the implementation of neighborhood scale, as well as site-specific solutions, design guidelines, and policies. So, for example, in Buzzard Point, we're looking for ways to design parks that provide recreation, while at the same time providing flood mitigation. So we're looking for ways to identify equitable ways to implement flood reduction along coastal and interior areas. And we're looking at the financial impacts of flooding on low and fixed income homeowners. And so I think it's, one of the other things we're focusing on is looking at the how do we prioritize protection of vulnerable populations? How do we preserve affordable housing and economic growth and development, and also looking at ways to mitigate disparities in real estate access and equity. So this work is critical because what has traditionally been the 500-year floodplain is now essentially the 100-year floodplain. So land areas that had a fairly minimal risk of flooding in any year now have about a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So this is in part due to storm surge, and we can see in the lower chart the number of days per year with over 3 inches of precipitation, and that's projected to rise. So one of the other major initiatives that I work on is Sustainable DC. And Sustainable DC is a district strategic plan to be the greenest, healthiest, and most livable city for all its residents. And this is a 20-year plan that's co-led by OP and DOE, the Department of Energy and Environment. And we've been partners on this since 2012. So it's significant in the sense that, this is a long-standing partnership. I think it's, we realized that the district needed a holistic plan that considers a system level approach to these 13 different action areas. And these action areas include everything from health to waste to nature to education. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on, but some of the goals of Sustainable DC include reductions, 50% carbon emissions reduction, a 50% reduction in energy consumption, and 50% of our energy to come from renewable sources. And Katie and Casey will talk more about these in a minute. And critically, Mayor Bowser has made additional commitments to achieve zero carbon output for the district by 2050. So Sustainable DC, it's somewhat unique in that we produce a yearly progress report detailing our progress on all 167 actions. Whoop, went a little bit far. And so we've made strides in quantifying how these 13 systems and 167 actions are interrelated, although it's, this is really complex. It remains a work in progress, but here are a few key indicators. So our goal is to have 75% of our trips taken by bicycle, walking, or transit. We're at about 52%, a little over 52. We'd like to get 100% of neighborhoods to be walkable. We're at about 63%. We've reduced our emissions by 31%, the goal of 50% reduction, and then we're very close to achieving our tree canopy goal of 40% tree canopy cover. We're at about 39%. So we know that increasing urbanization that replaces vegetated space with concrete and pavement can result in heat islands, and spaces that reach higher temperatures and retain heat longer than the surrounding areas, and they can reduce health quality and negatively impact air quality. So we're looking to, wherever possible, include policies in our citywide and our place-based work that focuses on reducing the urban heat island with cool and green roofs, expanded green space, cool pavement, tree planting, and tree protective efforts. And we're really prioritizing hotspots in those areas with the greatest number of heat vulnerable residents. And you can kind of see in that map on the left there, those are the heat islands. Specifically, we're looking to incorporate heat island mitigation into planning for green infrastructure, for tree canopy, and parks and public space initiatives. So an example of an area where we have incorporated heat island mitigation is through the zoning regulations. Zoning regulations are a tool. They can do some things, they can't do everything, but we have identified sort of this tool, the green area ratio, and developed it over time. It's an environmentally sustainable zoning regulation that sets standards for landscape and site design to help reduce stormwater runoff, improve air quality, and keep the city cooler. So we're the second city in the country to try it after Seattle. I'll also note that these are four areas where there are buildings require a building permit. So it does not include single family zones, but in those areas we've revised the zoning regs to include a pervious surface requirement for those lower density residential areas. So GAR, it works through providing a menu of landscape elements and establishes a minimum score. You have to establish a minimum score for new development. So in addition to conventional landscape elements, the menu includes things like green roofs, vegetative walls, pervious paving, and bonuses for public visibility. It increases the amount of landscaping required while also increasing design flexibility. So the idea wasn't to create an onerous regulation. The idea was to create something that increases the amount of urban landscaping in dense urban areas while allowing for increased flexibility for developers and designers to efficiently use their properties. So I think that's the key, the flexibility. So we've heard people say that, well, GR might conflict with other planning goals, such as creating lively and engaging streetscapes, and it could result in sites with overly large setbacks. We have found that's not really the case. GR requirements can be met while still allowing for effective site design, and you can include project elements consistent with the district's planning goals, such as pedestrian plazas that include public seating, cafe seating, and retail opportunities. So examples exist where landscape features have been incorporated into designs that accommodate both gathering spaces and green features. So on the upper right is an example of a green roof installation. And these areas have dual functions as green roofs while also serving as gathering spaces and amenity space for the building residents. These are the types of alignments that we're continue to seek out, where we can mitigate and adapt to climate change while serving other functions and achieving other district goals. Okay, so that concludes our presentation. Thanks so much for your time. As you can see, Rogelio and I start off at a really high level to show you what we are thinking about at a citywide and sometimes regional scale in terms of planning for climate change. Please contact us with any questions. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you both so much. So now I'm going to introduce our next speakers. So first we have Katie Bergfeld. Katie is the branch chief for building performance and enforcement in the Energy Administration at the Department of Energy and Environment. She has been with the agency since January 2015, when she was brought in to help manage the district's benchmarking program, which requires all large commercial buildings to report their energy and water usage to the district on an annual basis. Katie currently oversees the team that administers all facets of the district's benchmarking program, as well as the development and implementation of the district's new building energy performance standards that were set forth in the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act of 2018. Prior to joining DOEE, Katie worked as a program specialist with the U.S. Green Building Council, where she worked in the LEED certified department. She has an MA in Natural Resources and Sustainable Development from American University, a BS in Environmental Studies from Emory University. She is a certified energy manager, LEED accredited professional, and project management professional. And she is joined by Casey Studhalter. Casey joined DC's Department of Energy and Environment as a program analyst in the Urban Sustainability Administration in February 2018. In this role, he coordinates interagency green building efforts across the district. Casey also serves as the DOEE representative in the construction codes development process and chairs the Green Construction and Commercial Energy Conservation Codes Technical Group. Prior to DOEE, Casey spent 8 years at the U.S. Green Building Council, where he led various technical development efforts, served as a subject matter expert, and led a grant program to build the capacity of affordable housing developers to achieve certification. Casey earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Washington and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Virginia Tech. I'll pass things along to them.
Great, thank you so much. This is Casey Studhalter with DC's Department of Energy and Environment, and just want to take a second to say thank you to DC Preservation League for having us, for providing this great platform to engage with all of you, and thank you to Rogelio and Stephen for a great introduction. I think hopefully I'll continue to build on their really strong foundation, and again take this a little bit further to talk more specifically about buildings and climate mitigation, as Stephen introduced. So within the Department of Energy and Environment, I work within the Urban Sustainability Administration. It's a branch within our agency that functions much like a mayor's office of sustainability might, and my focus is on green buildings. And then I will turn it over after I wrap up to my colleague Katie Bergfeld. So hopefully we can build again on a lot of that great Office of Planning context and sort of move more towards into, I think there's a clean split between my presentation and Katie's talking about new construction and major renovations. And then next we will transition to focusing on existing buildings. So there is a fair even split between our topics. So again, Sustainable DC really set that broad umbrella goal to make DC the healthiest, greenest, most livable city for all district residents. And we continue to implement that in a variety of increasingly specific ways. So the details are maybe not important here, but this is really just to show that the district has a long timeline of a variety of sustainability focused policies and actions. The Green Building Act, dating all the way back to 2006, really started requiring green building certifications of buildings. At the time, it required privately funded buildings to achieve a level of certification, which was quite innovative at the time. Sustainable DC came in a few years later, as Stephen and Rogelio introduced. The green area ratio followed. And then we did introduce building energy and water benchmarking, which has been in place for 10 years now. So that's another, at the time, incredibly innovative policy to require buildings to disclose their energy and water use, which is then shared publicly and has informed future policies. So that's an interesting note on the roadmap. So just to show that there have been a number of actions over the last 15 years and many more to come. The details here look very familiar, again, building on the goals that came from Sustainable DC, but hopefully these show how some of those goals have been channeled into the various sort of nested implementation plans. So up here in the upper right, we see Climate Ready DC, and that's our climate adaptation plan, which really is focusing on how does the district, especially our built environment, adapt to a changing climate. Incredibly important, although not the focus of our conversation here today. So happy to talk about resilience. Incredibly important, especially in your work, but not going to be the focus today. So just acknowledging that that's there and is a wonderful piece, a wonderful resource. But many of the goals, at least in my world, in my work from Sustainable DC, are sort of provided a little bit more detail and really focused on implementation in the Clean Energy DC plan, and that's the district's climate action plan. And so we have taken, I think the next slide actually provides some of the high level goals, but Clean Energy DC focuses on the transportation sector, the energy sector, and building sector. And within the buildings focus, there are two really top line goals called out in the plan. One is to adopt a net zero energy building code by 2026. And we are underway working towards that goal now. And I can chat a little bit more about that in a minute. And another of the goals set out in the plan focuses on existing buildings and is the building energy performance standard. And that, again, we are well underway. The regulations are in place, and Katie can talk more about that in a moment. The plan also calls for 100% renewable electricity by 2032, with 10% of that coming from local solar. And that also is well underway. The last two of these, the existing buildings piece and the renewable electricity, were memorialized in a piece of legislation in late 2019, early 2020. The net zero energy building code has not yet been, but there is a piece of legislation proposed by council that would memorialize that and codify that as well. So the similar data, Stephen highlighted the source of our greenhouse gas emissions in the district. And what we look at when we see where they're coming from is that 74%, it's down a little bit now, of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the building sector in the district. So energy that's consumed in buildings represents really the lion's share of greenhouse gas emissions. And so that means buildings are a key lever if we're talking about climate change mitigation in the district. This pie chart looks a little bit differently for the district than it does for other cities. Not that our buildings are any worse, but rather what's missing is that heavy industry. So there's not a lot of heavy industry that does factor into this distribution for other jurisdictions. So that means, what we have control over are buildings, and they are a key lever, and that shows in much of our focus on buildings, both new construction and existing. So again, some of this analysis coming out of our climate action plan. On the left, we see this wedge chart showing the relative contributions of buildings, the energy supply, and transportation, in how each of them and the proposed actions in the plan will help us reach that 50% GHG reduction by 2032. And I think, again, what's really important is just to show that we need everything on the table as we're talking about comprehensive climate action in the district to meet those climate action goals, to meet the Paris Accord commitments. We can't pick and choose which actions the district is interested in pursuing. It's really all of them are needed if we're going to meet this goal. And then on the right, of those savings, of that 50% reduction, this shows sort of the relative impact of each of those sectors. And again, looking at buildings, that goal of net zero energy new construction by 2026 will provide 10% of those total savings. So a key piece. But if we look at the other green slice there, existing buildings, the proposed building energy performance standard that's now been enacted is expected to provide double that savings. So existing buildings are really a key piece, again, within that building's lever in addressing climate change in the district. Very relevant to all of your work. So pulling from the Clean Energy DC plan, again, it calls for net zero energy new construction and major renovations. So I can drill down a little bit more into that, into those requirements and how they're germane in the preservation world. So there was an update to the energy code, actually to the entire suite of the construction codes passed in 2020. The name is the 2017 Energy Code, which is an indication of how long that was in the making. And in the latest update to the commercial provisions of the Energy Code, which apply to both commercial buildings as well as multifamily buildings, 4 stories and taller, we introduced a voluntary pathway called Appendix Z, which is our working definition for what that net zero energy goal may look like. So for those curious about what net zero means or what net zero could look like, that's a great place to find our up-to-date working definition. We anticipate that evolving, but we were excited to put that out in 2020. We then have a planned update in 2023, which we're working hard right now in developing that code language, in continuing our trajectory towards net zero, tightening up energy efficiency requirements, and then planning another step down for the codes in 2026. And the codes matter. I'll step back, I won't dwell on this, but the codes really only apply to the scope of work. So if you are renovating an existing building, renovating a historic building, the entirety of the code does not necessarily apply. It's really only to the scope of the project. This is redundant for many of you, but just to point out that as the efficiency requirements advance on, say, the Energy Code, the code only applies to your scope of work. So we're not then therefore going to require that the windows are replaced if it's only an HVAC replacement, or so it is sort of, it scales, but we are continuing to advance the code requirements for energy efficiency, whether it's equipment or envelope or all of the above. I won't dwell on this, but thinking about net zero for major renovations or new construction, on the surface, it's a very simple concept. We want a energy efficient building that supplies the energy it uses with clean, renewable energy over the course of the year. That's the net. So it's not necessarily net zero in any one moment, but over the course of the year, the energy used is matched by the energy produced. But first, it really does need to be an energy efficient building. We don't want solar farms dedicated to powering inefficient, leaky buildings. It doesn't scale well. We'll never be able to reach that goal. So what Appendix Z does in the details is start to refine some of those, it starts to cap what that energy efficiency needs to look like, put some goals there, define some language around where that energy can be generated and procured to minimize transmission losses and benefit the local economy to the maximum extent possible. So for those interested, I can provide a link in the follow-up, but Appendix Z does provide some details around what on the surface is a relatively simple concept. And then I'll put this out there, perhaps this is a conversation to be had in the discussion or in the questions, but embodied carbon is something that we talk about a lot. It's a very recent, very prescient sort of topic in our world, but it's also very much a new conversation. So currently, the idea of embodied carbon, as many of you know, is the building materials that we use to construct a building emit a significant amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases during the extraction, the manufacture and refinement, the shipping and transportation, and then also thinking about the end of life disposal. So there's a lot of carbon dioxide emitted before anyone turns on a light switch in a building. And so how do we account for that? How do we measure that? How do we track that? Perhaps how do we shrink that and address it? And these are all great questions and very much an ongoing effort here in the district and around the world. There's a lot of talk about it, but we currently don't measure it or regulate it. The district has a goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, as my friends at the Office of Planning shared earlier. That doesn't yet include embodied carbon. The Clean Energy DC plan and Sustainable DC before that don't address embodied carbon at all, which I think is indicative of the fact that it's a really new topic. It's evolving science. We do have a carbon-free DC plan under development now, and that is the goal. That will incorporate embodied carbon. That will be the place in which we begin to measure it, track it, and identify opportunities to reduce it. And so that's coming, I believe, within the next early 2022, early next year. We should anticipate to see a draft of this plan. So that's another of those sort of nested plans coming soon. And I think, as certainly will be talked about in future programs, and is again very germane to this audience, building reuse is a huge opportunity for addressing and mitigating that embodied carbon. The greenest building is the one that's already built, and that is largely due to that embodied carbon represented in the concrete and steel that's already there. So your work in making sure that those buildings continue on and that carbon remains in place is hugely important. So it's a new frontier for us. Put it out there as a teaser, and if you're interested, we can talk about that more in the questions. There are some great resources that we're trying to compile around net zero energy buildings and high performing buildings, largely new construction, but also very applicable to major retrofits. The web address there at the bottom is our net zero energy landing page, our effort to try to compile all of these great resources from throughout the agency and across the district into one accessible place. So hopefully that's of use. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Katie Bergfeld.
Hi, everyone. So I think we did a really great job of sort of giving the bird's eye view at the beginning of this presentation, and then sort of drilled down a little bit more on some of the specific climate action, mitigation things that we're implementing here in the district. And so now I'm going to get even more nitty gritty here on one specific part of our climate action plan that Casey mentioned, which is the building energy performance standards that were enacted in the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act of 2018. So this program builds off of, as Casey mentioned, we've had a benchmarking and disclosure law here in the district since 2008. So nearly 13 or over 13 years. Large commercial buildings have been required to track their energy and water usage, report that to the Department of Energy and Environment, and then we publicly disclose that information. And I can provide a link in our website or in the chat to show you where you can go to see that information if you would like to take a look at it. So we've been doing that effectively for about 8 years now, because the regulations were finalized in 2013. So we have over a decade of energy use data on our largest buildings here in the district. And that includes DC-owned buildings as well. And when I say large commercial buildings, I'm talking about privately owned buildings over 50,000 square feet. And then I'm talking about DC-owned buildings over 10,000 square feet. Right now, the law covers about 2,000 buildings here in the district. So we have lots of data. And that data is sort of been the foundation for how we've been able to build out our climate action plan. Large pieces of the Clean Energy DC plan were built off of that data that we have been collecting for years. And so that has allowed us, we really take a data-driven approach to climate action here at the department. That's not to say that other factors don't matter, but particularly with Clean Energy DC, it was very data-driven, and we were able to do that because of policies like that. And so building off of that, Council, as Casey mentioned, took some pieces of the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act and codified them. One of the largest pieces of that Omnibus Act is the Building Energy Performance Standards Program. And so now buildings are not only required to track their energy and water usage, but they are now going to be required to meet minimum energy performance standards. And as you can see here on the slide, essentially what the legislation states is that on or before January 1st, 2021, DOE will establish a minimum threshold of energy performance that is no lower than the local median Energy Star score. To explain what the Energy Star score is essentially all buildings track their energy and water usage in a tool called Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which is administered by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Nearly all buildings are sort of put on this sort of model that's built out by Energy Star, by US EPA. And that you're essentially given a score on a scale of 1 to 100 to tell you how you're performing relative to other buildings of that same type. So for example, if you're an office building, you're being compared to office buildings nationally. And essentially that score tells you how you're performing compared to those buildings. On a scale of 1 to 100, the national median by definition is a 50. Here in the district, our buildings are a little bit more efficient. So the median Energy Star score for our offices in 2019 was actually a 71. So our buildings are a little bit more efficient on the whole. And so what council said is essentially that DOE must take that data and set a median, at least a performance standard that hits at least at that median of either Energy Star score or what we refer to as source energy use intensity for buildings that cannot receive a score. I'm not going to get into the details of why a building can or cannot receive a score, but just generally that's sort of what the legislation states. It also states that DOE is to reset the standard every 6 years. So this is meant to be a continuous improvement policy. Buildings are going to be held to these standards every 6 years. I'll talk about in a minute what you have to do if you do not meet the standard. But this is not meant to be a one-time thing. This is meant to be a continuous improvement that just goes on in perpetuity, essentially. So essentially the way that it works is, so the owner benchmarks their building, which means they track their energy water usage, they report that to DOE. We take that data, we establish the standards based on that data. And then we ask the question, does the building meet the standard or not? So I mentioned earlier, the median Energy Star score for office buildings is 71. And it's based, this sort of round of BEPS is based on the calendar year 2019 data, because that's the data we had available when we were setting the standard. And so essentially, people who have an office building here in the district will look at their Energy Star score that was reported in calendar year 2019, and then we'll say, is it above a 71 or is it below a 71? And so if the building meets, if it meets a 71 or above, the building doesn't have any sort of regulatory requirements. You met the standard, you're good to go. Buildings that do not meet that standard. So for example, the office building has an Energy Star score of 70 or below. They will be required to enter a compliance cycle. And so the compliance cycles, essentially, there are several pathways that building owners can take to meet what we're calling the energy efficiency requirements. Two of them are spelled out in the legislation. The primary one is called the performance pathway. And essentially, again, any buildings that do not meet the BEPS at the beginning of the cycle are placed in a compliance cycle, whereby they have to reduce their site, or where they have to choose a pathway to reduce or increase the efficiency of their building. The performance pathway is essentially just states that the building has to reduce its on-site energy use consumption by 20%. And that's based on an energy use intensity, which is your energy use per square foot. So any buildings following the performance pathway, essentially what we're saying is over a 5-year period, so all the compliance cycles are 5 years, over a 5-year period, you have to reduce your site energy use intensity by 20%. And then the other pathway spelled out in the legislation is the prescriptive pathway. And a prescriptive pathway is more action-based. It's established by DOE, and we have established it through a compliance guidebook that we just released, whereby building owners essentially have to check off a set of actions that will lead to them reducing their energy, reducing the energy load of the building, increasing the efficiency of the building. Some of the other pathway options that are spelled out in the legislation include some alternative compliance pathway options, which I'm not going to get into very deeply today because there's a lot. I will talk about the baseline adjustments a little bit. You can see it's sort of the third box over, because that one is one that affects some of the historic properties here in the district. And we actually built in some of the flexibilities in that pathway to help adjust for some of the challenges that we know that historic buildings might have in making efficiency upgrades in their buildings and doing retrofits. And so just to give you a sense of what this all looks like together. So as I stated, the BEPS periods are 6-year periods whereby DOE sets a standard at the beginning of that 6-year period. Buildings are going to be required to continue to benchmark their buildings every year. So they're submitting data to DOE every year. That is still a requirement. Every 3 years, that data is going to have to be third-party verified. So that means that the building owner is going to have to go out and find a third-party contractor who has specific credentials that can actually verify that the data is correct. And then any buildings that do not meet the standards are placed on a 5-year compliance cycle, whereby they have to choose one of the compliance pathways that I spelled out earlier on the previous slides, with the ultimate goal of most of the pathways are built around this idea that the building has to reduce its energy use intensity by about 20%. So that's sort of the basics of the BEPS program. And then there's an extra year there for DOE to do data analysis and enforcement. And talking about enforcement, so building owners that do not, building owners that don't meet the BEPS and then are placed in a compliance cycle with that goal of reducing their energy usage by 20% or following the prescriptive pathway can face penalties if they do not meet the goals of their pathway. The level of those penalties are essentially based on the gross floor area of the building, and it's going to be about $10 per square foot. So building owners that, again, let's say you had a 20% reduction, you chose the performance pathway, and you did not reach that 20% reduction, you could be on the hook for about $10 per square foot fine, maximum penalty. But the maximum penalties will be reduced based on sort of how far you get to achieving that goal. So let's say, for a very simple example, you were supposed to get a 20% reduction, you only got a 10% reduction, your maximum penalty would be reduced by 50%. And so that's sort of what's been proposed in our regulations, just to give you a scale of what building owners are facing if they do not meet the energy efficiency requirements. And then, that sort of talks about, the stick part of things. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the flexibilities and then the carrot that we are working on. So we have had nearly over 2 years of discussions with stakeholders about this program after the legislation was passed. And essentially, we were asked to build in flexibilities for certain types of properties, one of which being historic properties. We had extensive conversations with a lot of our university partners who often own or manage a lot of historic buildings. And the conclusion that we came to, the first conversation that we had was, well, shouldn't historic buildings have a different standard, right? So shouldn't, let's say, if you're an office building and you were built, post 1970 versus pre 1940, should there be a different standard for pre 1940? So we actually went and looked at the data, and our data does not show a major correlation between building age and building performance, which surprises a lot of people. A lot of people tend to believe that newer buildings are automatically more efficient than older buildings. And that is not the case from our data. And that is also backed up by a lot of national surveys. The US EPA's data has shown the same. A lot of it is about how you operate the building. Obviously system upgrades and things make a big difference, but also operations of the building is a big piece of that. And so that's what our data has shown. So we stepped back and said, okay, there's no data showing that we should set a different standard, right? But what we probably should do is build in some flexibilities on how historic buildings can comply with the energy efficiency requirements, recognizing that there are logistical challenges often in making upgrades in historic buildings that other buildings do not face. So one of those being a baseline adjustment. So I mentioned before, buildings that have to make a 20% reduction in their building, there's going to be a baseline versus an evaluation at the end of the compliance cycle. And essentially, buildings that are deemed historic properties as per the Office of Planning, they essentially can apply for what we're calling a baseline adjustment. So they can come to us and say, our building is historic, it's going to, being a historic building is going to create challenges. They'll make it harder for us to be able to meet that 20% reduction. But we still, know that we have this regulatory requirement. So what can DOE do for us? And what that looks like is we sort of have two different ways that building owners can make a request on their baseline. One being a baseline shift. So they can request that DOEE shift the year by which their baseline is set. So most buildings are defaulted to an average baseline between 2018 and 2019. Building owners can come to us and say, there was something weird going on in my building, or something was happening that was outside of normal business practices, and we actually want you to shift our baseline year to just 2018. And that's a request that building owners can make for all different types of reasons that were spelled out on the previous slide. The evaluation year in this instance will be in 2026. We extended it by 1 year due to COVID. So buildings would then be compared to their performance in calendar year 2026. The other option, and I think this would probably be what most historic buildings would probably ask for, just my observation, is a baseline modification. So essentially, in this case, in this example, the building added increased ventilation that added sort of 5 kBTU per square foot. So that added to their energy use intensity, but they did it for a reason that was, protecting the occupancy of the folks in the building. And so instead of penalizing that improvement, because we want to encourage increase in ventilation, particularly in the days of COVID, DOE could modify that baseline and allow for a little bit of wiggle room for that building owner to not essentially have to go as far in terms of the 20% reduction. So it's essentially what that looks like. I imagine that would apply more to historic buildings as well, asking for some sort of adjustment to their baseline based on some of the challenges they might be facing. The other thing that I want to point out, and this piece of our regulations was built out. We had a lot of discussions with our friends in the Office of Planning about delays of compliance. So the legislation allows DOE to provide a delay of compliance for up to 3 years to building owners if they meet certain criteria. And essentially, that criteria, I'm not going to go through every single piece of criteria, but some of it includes, if the building is in financial distress, if the building is, about to demolish, things like that. So one of the pieces that we didn't have in there that our friends of Office of Planning helped us build in was this recognition of historic buildings. So buildings that are on the DC inventory of historic sites or designated as contributing to a historic district that experience a delay in their project implementation. So you're trying to do a retrofit, and because of your historic status, you are not able to get the retrofit completed in the 5-year period and meet the 20% reduction, essentially can apply to DOEE and say, we need more time. We need at least 2 more years, or we need another year. So those buildings have to come to DOEE and they have to present not only that they are a historic building that we could verify, but also present why being a historic building presents a challenge to them making the retrofits in the 6-year period that they've been given, or 5-year period, depending on how you're looking at it. So this is another flexibility that we've built in, again, based on the feedback and discussions we've had with our friends at the Office of Planning. So another flexibility built in. And that's sort of the overview of BEPS and, some of the considerations we've made for historic buildings. I'm happy to answer any questions you all have. Where we are in terms of the timeline in implementing the program is we set the first BEPS on January 1st. So those are in effect. They are published on our website. We have a cost benefit study that's coming out very soon that will talk about sort of what, we did sort of an analysis through a grant of how much it will actually cost building owners to comply with these requirements. And we have also we have another set of regulations that should hopefully be coming out in the next month or two as final, that are essentially the compliance regulations. So I stated before, we set the BEPS, and now we're essentially telling people how they are supposed to meet our energy efficiency requirements through regulations. Those should be coming out very soon. They went through 2 rounds of public comments. And we're hoping that they will get published as final soon, but remains to be seen because they're still moving through the approval process. And then we have a compliance guidebook that really digs into the details of how building and provides guidance on how buildings should meet the regulatory requirements. And we hope that that will be published sometime soon. It's been published as draft. we've collected public comment on it. We're reviewing that public comment now. And then the last thing I want to mention is we have a lot of assistance and incentives and financing programs that we are aligning to help building owners comply. So I talked about the stick earlier, now I'm talking a little bit about the carrot. I think most of you on the line are probably familiar with the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, but if you're not, essentially they are a third-party contract administrator for the district to administer the efficiency programs here in the district. So they work with all customers that are ratepayers to help them improve the efficiency of their buildings. We have our DC Green Bank, which offers creative financing solutions to building owners that are looking to do energy retrofits, also funded by the district currently. And then we have our Building Innovation Hub, which is a grantee that we have essentially funded to help building owners not just meet the BEPS, but to go further and start looking at net zero. They provide assistance, technical assistance, and sort of connection to resources to building owners that are trying to do all these great things that we really want them to do. And then furthermore, really exciting this year is we had sort of, we have an influx of funding coming from the American Rescue Plan, on the tune of about $30 million that is going to help bolster our assistance and financing programs. We have a lot more information coming out about that very soon, but it's very exciting. We have a lot of money coming to help building owners. A major focus this year will be on multifamily affordable housing buildings and assisting them with the soft costs and some of the hard costs of trying to do building retrofits, along with offering some technical assistance to those building owners. And that is it from my side. Happy to take any questions.
All right, everybody. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. So just be back here in 10 minutes and we'll get started on our next presenter, okay?
Great. So we're going to get started again. And our final speaker today, prior to our questions and answers, is Amania Price. Amania is a historic preservation specialist with the DC Historic Preservation Office. She has worked with the Maryland State Historic Preservation Office and the City of Annapolis on their flood mitigation and historic preservation initiatives. She's currently working on the DC's disaster plan program for historic properties and sites. Amania graduated from Spelman College with a BA in history and has a master's in historic preservation from the University of Maryland at College Park. And we really appreciate her time today. We know she's very busy with lots of reviews around the district with regards to our historic district. So Amania, thank you, and you can take it away.
Hi, well, good morning, everyone. Glad to be here to present to you today on sustainability and the Historic Preservation Office. So the Historic Preservation Office is responsible for the planning and the development and review of over 700 landmarks, historic landmarks in the DC area, as well as over 70 historic districts within the DC region. HPO is also responsible for ensuring that work is done on historic properties is compatible with their historic character. We do this through planning, design review of building plans, permits, and subdivision applications. I've been working as a historic preservation specialist, responsible for design review of areas in the Anacostia Historic District, as well as the U Street Historic District. And so there are over thousands of historic contributing buildings in the DC area, in the DC region. And right now it is a very prime time to be talking about maintenance in a way of sustainability and not just converting it from one use to another. And so the current policies that we've been trying to make sure that the DC Historic Preservation Office follows is the DC Comprehensive Plan. And the DC Comprehensive Plan was recently released, and it identified that natural hazards, or HPO has identified that natural hazards and the effect of climate change has threatened the DC's ability to preserve its historic and cultural significant properties. And so our office identified that there needs to be a resiliency design principle that will go for our historic and cultural resources. And so by reinforcing the goals of preservation through more policies and programming, we'll be able to support more resilience and sustainable growth. And by coordinating with local groups and agencies, we'll be able to provide more resources to support sustainable preservation efforts. In order to have a substantial impact on these new policies, HPO is engaging with other agencies such as DOEE and DDOT to provide input on upcoming policy updates, as we just heard, as well as strategies for them to consider that will affect the cultural resources in the area. As the Office of Planning, Stephen mentioned, there are family of plans out here, and historic preservation always wants to be a topic of consideration. The DC Historic Preservation Plan is going to be up for its renewal and for the 2025 year. And so this plan hopes to incorporate more conversations about not only climate change and how to make sure there's mitigated strategies for historic buildings, but also disaster planning as well. And so one of the guidance that we put out for to start off the sustainability of historic properties was our sustainability guide for older and historic buildings. This guide is intended to promote and facilitate green retrofits of existing older buildings in a manner that will improve their performance and energy efficiency while being respectful of their character. Green retrofits are any type of upgrade to existing building intended to improve energy and environmental performances, reducing water usage and improving the comfort and quality of this space in terms of natural light, air quality, and noise. The performance improvement of these buildings provide an opportunity to continue the financial environmental of the investments made in initial construction of these structures. Primarily, we have a lot of pre-1945 small scale buildings. However, this methodology can be used for evaluating planning for larger scale buildings and commercial buildings as well. And so retrofitting existing older buildings in the district is positive for several reasons. One of the reasons, of course, is meaningful environmental benefits to lower energy use, less emissions, reducing energy costs to the owner, providing thermal comfort, improving thermal comfort, and more efficient systems for building occupants, and protection of the city's older buildings, which will preserve the unique character of DC and its neighborhoods. And so by retaining these existing buildings, they also lower the energy consumption and allows for a benefit of not only getting a positive energy consumption, but also a great protection for DC's natural cultural resources. And so historic sustainability, historic sustainable building features are not new for historic buildings, and they're inherently sustainable. A lot of times there are energy efficient building features that were designed as a necessity in these older buildings in response to the local climate. And so these strategies maximize local natural light, ventilation, and heating. Some of the common features found in these buildings that Our sustainable features include thick walls and party wall construction, operable windows and transoms, attic vents, dormers, and high ceilings, shutters and awnings, and definitely landscaping and site features. And so it's important to consider that when you are looking at your building, that the buildings are more than their individual component. These design materials and types of this construction and size all play a role in how the building performs. Historic building constructions all have responded to the local climate when they were built. And so it's important to see how your building is operating now with those existing features in it. A key to a successful rehabilitation project is to identify and understand any lost original features of the existing energy efficient aspects of the building, and then to identify and understand its character defining features to ensure that they are preserved. So considerations for altering a historic building in general, these are just guidelines to keep in mind when you're working or considering altering a historic contributing building. You want to make sure that you're looking at its visibility and its prominence from the street, as well as where it sits along the street in its row. What is the level of the property's significance? Is it unique to the row? Is it a property that was built as one of three? What year was it built? And is that year within the period of significance for that historic district? And so all of these things determine the property's level of integrity and significance for either historic district or even a landmark property. Context and compatible design. You're looking at the quality of the design and the materials. And so when you're looking to alter a historic building, what is the quality of the materials that you're going to be replacing existing fabric with, and how are they designed? And then, are these temporary and additive changes versus a permanent destructive change? And so is this something that can be removed or moved to a different portion of the property? Or once it's been installed or once it's been placed on the property, is it a permanent, and has it completely deteriorated the existing fabric that was there? And then, of course, what is a reasonable balance of new material to historic material? And what is the integrity that, that plays with those new to old materials? So these are considerations that you would be looking at beyond just environmental and sustainability, but just overall work on a historic building. So planning a green retrofit, planning to retrofit your existing older building should take a comprehensive approach to reducing environmental impacts through consumption and waste and emissions. And so there are some steps to understanding and working on a green retrofit to your property. The first one kind of goes back to our last slide, which is knowing your property, evaluating it. What is its level of significance? What is its additive changes? And then evaluate the current performance of the building. As it sits, you need to identify what the deficiencies are, and then determine if there are some priorities and some goals that need to be looked at for evaluating a green retrofit of a historic building. 3 is to optimize the performance of existing systems. And so we talked about things that were operable transoms or party walls. And so how are we optimizing the performances of those existing systems, including weatherizing and changing filters? Are we doing everything to make sure that the existing building fabric is working as it's supposed to as well? And then we have to define your goals. And so your goals should include reaching for a specific energy usage target. Previously, Casey and Katie talked about some of the codes that they have implemented and the considerations that they've given to historic preservation, which is great, but that doesn't mean that you will be unable to reach those goals and those energy codes. Right now is a great time to identify and see what a target is, and then what you would need to do to reach the specific standard. Or you can also lower that into a more residential meaning of if the owner is just looking to reduce some energy costs and not necessarily do a full green retrofit, then that may be a way to plan accordingly. Then step 5, the plan should be designed and tailored specifically for your building and your climate, making sure that your strategy is beneficial to cost and complexity. It's important to develop a coordinated plan based on those needs and the goals that you just determined. If your primary goal is to reduce energy bills, you may want to start small, especially for homeowners, but for larger property owners, you might be looking at making less passive sustainable changes. And so what would those be, and what would you need to do to meet that goal? And then step 6, which is during and after your implementation of upgrades, you should regularly monitor your work and make adjustments accordingly. I'm going to move a little faster for you guys. So some strategies. These are strategies that should align, that could align with your project goals, and considered sustainable and character-defining features also. So strategies include retrofitting your walls and roofs, your windows and doors, or your installing roof projects such as a green roof or solar panels. So with walls and roofs, and when considering doing a retrofit, you want to provide proper ventilation. You want to make sure your roofs and walls are providing the proper ventilation and insulation, which will improve the energy of older buildings. Venting the attic can increase the airflow and help control the moisture and buildup. But there's also ways to insulate a roof or space that can increase energy efficiency of older building codes through a different step. And so such as like light coloring or reflective roofing material as a way to get multiple benefits from reflecting the sun off of the building, as well as adding a layer of insulation. So ventilation can be passive with operable windows and vents, or active, which is more mechanical circulation. Passive is more of what older buildings and historic buildings were used. They were, how do we make ventilation possible without air conditioning units? Okay, our windows, our vents. Making sure that they have a breezeway. And so currently, more modern commercial buildings most likely will be employing mechanical ventilation. And so knowing that you can have passive ventilation, and especially during a time right now where ventilation is so important, it's good to know that it doesn't always have to come from installing a mechanical unit, and that you could be taking some cues from looking at the placement of your windows and your transoms, and making sure, and your vents, and making sure that those are working at their best capacity as well. And so some of these wall assemblies are just showing interior insulation upgrades, insulating roof or attic space for increasing efficiency, energy efficiency. And a lot of times we want to make sure from a review standpoint that when a developer or a contractor is submitting plans, that they're articulating in their drawings their roof assemblies, and how, and hopefully how they would be insulating the property as well when they're doing their retrofits, or even just updating a building, renovating it, or rehabbing one, a historic building. Windows and doors, regular maintenance and replacement of exterior and interior doors, sealants, gaskets, weather stripping around windows can significantly improve energy performance. It's a lot of times as a reviewer, I see just replacement of window. That's the main thing. I don't see a lot of repair of wooden windows. And so, but regular maintenance of these historic wooden windows can really help seal up and keep the draft out. And a lot of issues that a lot of homeowners feel can only be fixed with a new window can actually be fixed with repair and just some stewardship. So adding weather stripping to existing windows can increase the efficiency by almost 50%. A lot of heat loss through windows occurs through the perimeter of the sash, not necessarily the glass. And then your glass can be changed as well. You don't have to have just a single pane thickness. There are also ways that you can install new glass in your historic wooden windows. Replacing interior and exterior sealant and putty on glazings will have a significantly shorter lifetime to wood and glass window components. And so I want to just reiterate the fact that checking on and evaluating the building was really a great way to make sure that you're starting with what can we do to enhance the character defining features of the house to perform to their maximum efficiency before starting to replace and do more of those less passive replacements, those permanent repairs. Installing wood and exterior storm windows also improves thermal efficiency. They do not require a permit, and you can do that as you need to for your property. And they have definitely evolved over time to match your historic doors or historic framing, and you have a lot of variation with storm windows and doors. Roof installation. So there are over 1,400 buildings in the historic district, which has been renovated with the solar installations, which has been a very great initiative that the city has implemented. And it's a great thing for historic buildings as well. And Historic Preservation Office supports these retrofits. We would love for them to be in a manner, though, that respects the cultural, the architectural character. And so how can that happen? What do you need to look for? There are thinner panels, there are solar film systems, there are roofing materials and other different technologies that have been growing actually throughout the last 2-3 years to really provide some options for historic buildings so that you can still maintain the character of the roof line, still maintain the character of the property without having distracting roof installations on top and cutting off a lot of the sight lines that are really important in when you're looking at row homes or when you're looking at properties in historic districts. And so we have green roof and solar panels you can install and this just kind of goes to different methods on what you should be looking for when you are preparing to do a roof installation on your property, and just the type of things that our office will be looking to review with you are these considerations: moving the installation away from the roof edge, relocating the meters to run on the side versus the primary elevation. These are just ways that you can have, have these installations, as well as taking into consideration how they affect the primary facade and elevation of a historic building. And so lastly, I just want to kind of briefly talk about some challenges, preservation and sustainability challenges. Currently, there are a lot of new technologies and evolving strategies for sustainability, for sustainable building, and preservation has to get on board. We have to really make sure that we are engaged with these new technologies and making sure that we are communicating that back out to the public as options, and in protecting and preserving the fabric of DC's historic cultural resources, as well as providing funding and incentives. It's great. DOEE has some great incentive programs. We also have a historic homeowners grant program, but things that will be specifically to green retrofit, I believe, will really help promote green retrofit of historic buildings within not just our community, but with just local residents as well. And then preservation and sustainable education and public engagement is so important. I recently did a historic wood window demonstration in the Anacostia Historic District, and the questions that we received from homeowners about what to do with their historic wood windows, how to maintain them, were very basic, but really needed, and allowed for people to feel like they have more ownership and ability to do work on their historic property. So it shouldn't be a scary or intimidating process. Public engagement should definitely be on the forefront of it. And then lastly, preservation and historic building education for constructing professionals, making sure that there are people who can actually do this work. You know, a lot of times homeowners just don't know who to go to and who to call. And then often some contractors may not even be able to know how to look at a transom and make sure that it's still operable, or to remove the paint so that you can really get under that wood window, or installating properly. And so making sure we are providing education to construction professionals in historic preservation and sustainability would really help promote and ensure that there is a larger swath of knowledge throughout the city. And these are some resources. Please visit our website. We have tons of design guidelines, also on sustainability, but on walls and maintenance repair. And as well as the Park Service has some great tips for mitigation and guidelines on rehabilitating historic sites and briefs, as we all know. So please check it out, and thank you very much. I guess we'll do questions at the end, but if you have any other specific things, you can always give me a call at the Historic Preservation Office.
Well, thank you, Amania. I'm going to ask all of the speakers to come back onto screen, and we'll begin the Q&A session now. So I want to thank everybody. Really terrific morning's worth of presentations. I said before, drinking out of a fire hose, and I think that that is exactly what happened this morning. It just, we really covered a lot of material. Really appreciate how much you've really kind of added to the literature of what we're trying to do with our programming here. I'm going to kind of go in order of what the presentations were. And before I begin with any questions, I just want to remind everybody who is attending to submit questions through the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll certainly try to get them answered. This day's presentations just, not just met, but really exceeded my expectations of really both talking about the specifics of climate action, but also really putting it into the perspective of the challenges that we face as a community broadly, and then also the specifics of how do we make this work with existing and historic buildings. So again, just really terrific program. I want to start with Stephen. So I thought that it was extremely interesting to see I'll call it the harmonizing matrix of really the systems and scales. And I'm interested if you had any examples of really sort of how that played out, with conversations that take place over any specific program or policy, trying to use that analytical framework.
Yeah, I think, Carl, that, the resilience focus areas is kind of one of those areas where, we're considering sort of the global and national, implications of climate change and how, it's impacting sea level rise and impacting flooding on the 100 and 500-year floodplains. And then thinking about more about and then taking it down a step and thinking about, well, okay, we still are trying to balance these other priorities that we have. We have housing supply issues, and we have access to green space issues, and we have all these other competing issues. And so how do we balance those at a site specific level? And I think that we're going through this exercise now with our partners, our agency partners, to think about, okay, we want to enhance the housing supply, but we want to do it in a way that's safe. We don't want, we want to preserve life safety, but we want to develop in a way that doesn't, as I said, impact the housing supply, and we don't want to impact sort of the health equity issues. So that's the resilience focus areas, I think, crystallizes a lot of that. And I'm thinking about, well, okay, can we achieve several different objectives at once? So can we plan parks that flood, so thereby you're allowing for recreation, and you're positively impacting physical activity and therefore health, but in doing so in a way that allows for these areas to flood, and then that helps with mitigation. So it's a lot of it is just again, to sort of reiterate that point, that a lot of it is, we have limited resources. How do we best get the biggest bang for the buck and do multiple things at once on a system level? I think that's kind of the conversation we have a lot. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, very, very much so. So I was also interested in the reference to the DC Health Equity Report, which for me has been a study that really sort of puts legs under the conversations about affordability issues and equity issues in the city. From that, and from other considerations of, in the Office of Planning, how did the kind of major equity issues really sort of rise to the top? What really, what kind of drove really having OP kind of become awakened to what are the real DC issues that are priority issues?
Yeah, I think, well, first through the comprehensive plan process, we did several years of outreach to all communities in the district, is to understand what are the primary challenges. Secondly, we reached out to sister agencies, and DC Health was one of those agencies. And traditionally, we haven't had a close relationship with DC Health, I think, because we're in different, frankly, we're in different silos. They were at the time when we developed the comp plan in 2006, they were thinking more about clinical health and thinking about, well, where they're approaching health from how many hospital beds, how many clinics are you building in, and those are important considerations. However, they simultaneously came to the realization that the social determinants of health really were the way that we're going to approach and have an impact on health equity. So thinking about the housing supply, thinking about access to green space, thinking about air quality, heat island mitigation, all these things. And we sort of came at it from two different directions simultaneously. But the timing was terrific because they were working on their health equity report. We were working on our comprehensive plan, and they came together and aligned really well, I think. And it's something that we're continuing to work with them. We're a little bit sidetracked by COVID, but I think those conversations are continuing, and we're re-engaging with them. So yeah. So to answer your question, it was kind of a meeting of two agencies simultaneously.
Yeah, I have to tell you from my own perspective, just looking at the comprehensive plan and looking at the DC Health Equity Report, they just speak volumes about our community. They're just incredibly powerful, reports, an incredibly powerful plan. I'm terribly impressed with the work. So kind of where does it go from here with a comprehensive plan? Zoning updates or, sector plan updates or whatever. What's the future now that we have a new comprehensive plan on board?
Yes, you hit it exactly right on sector plans and sort of thinking about area planning, thinking about corridors and small area plans. And because we haven't done that for quite a few years, because we were doing the comprehensive plan for quite a while. So now the idea is how do we implement all of those high level actions at the neighborhood scale? So that's where we're going from here. And I'm sure there'll be some zoning updates as a result of the changes in the comp plan run by our development review division. But yeah, as far as what we're thinking about is, and it is more the neighborhood planning, and it's exciting because, like you said, you mentioned the health equity and thinking about it really explicitly for the first time, and then also how do we quantify these impacts, which is kind of a challenge. And admittedly, we mentioned, and I think both Casey and I mentioned, in Sustainable DC, sort of just beginning to think about, okay, well, if you do these set of actions, you're going to have this impact on health outcomes. That's not quite there. We're working on it, but making those, that causation relationship is still, I think, a work in progress. So, but it's exciting, I think, to take that down in the climate change policies, to take that down to the neighborhood level and see how we can implement them.
I can tell you that's music to my ears. I feel like as an architect, involved with specific projects, there's so many times that the kind of the owner's frustration with zoning issues or whatever, when there's a plan to have it be part of, when there's planning that goes with the regulations, it just helps so much to have an understanding of what the goals are of what those policies represent. And just, I'm very, very glad to hear it. So my last question for you, is one that Amania might want to jump in on as well. And that is, so with the comprehensive plan development, and specifically the future land use map, the FLUM, there's an acronym if there ever was one, and the general policy map, how did considerations of the historic districts really figure into the development of the comp plan and those two kind of essential maps?
Yeah, I think I will probably defer to Amania on that. She had a bigger role in sort of thinking about the interplay between historic preservation and historic districts and the comp plan, future land use, and generalized policy maps. But I think from our perspective and citywide, I mean, I think, as I was saying, the primary balancing act that we were doing was really more about thinking about transit-oriented development and how do we increase density in those corridors, and then thinking about also how do we thereby increase the housing supply. Definitely climate change and thinking about greenhouse gas emissions was part of that calculus, and thinking about, I mean, I think how you approach historic districts and thinking about, well, as you said, the buildings exist, and thinking about embodied carbon, and okay, they're already there. So from an embodied carbon perspective, you're actually saving you're actually saving carbon. That was part of it, but again, to Casey's point, we're still evolving in our thinking on that. It's not a new concept, but I think the calculations and the science is still evolving somewhat. So it was part of the calculus, but it's still working through it, I think, from our division's perspective. I'll turn it to Amania to see how you approached it.
Well, I was not on the high level of the planning of the comp plan. However, when they are talking about historic district, is more in a historic preservation standpoint from how can historic preservation be utilized for the land plan use. And so there's always going to be either more historic districts coming into play, being identified, how are communities able to have a deeper conversation about, is my area a historic district, and kind of opening up the conversation of not just historic districts, but kind of conservation spaces and areas where there may not actually be a historic district there, but there are also historic resources there. And so how are we incorporating those historic resources as a larger term and into the planning? And so it's definitely evolving. And I think right now, the conversation with historic districts is how are we getting the education of maintenance and stewardship, as well as public engagement back into the conversation of historic preservation within the city. So sustainability is a great way because it's hitting all parts of the city. So automatically it hits an older historic building. And so we have the chance to be able to open the conversation, not just for a historic district, but for an older building that is sitting in a historic in DC. And what does that mean for the city?
Yeah, I just add to, I mean, I think from a site perspective and thinking about regulations, it's a lot of it is how do we balance these competing priorities? So if we have a building in a historic district, do we need to reevaluate our public space regulations or zoning regulations, or how do we tweak them perhaps so we can do multiple things at once? We can preserve a historic structure, but we can also help facilitate, if it's net zero or if it's BEPS or whatever it is, how can we align all of those priorities at a site level? So I think that's an ongoing conversation.
Well, I think that's a really good way to put it, really aligning those things at the site level. I mean, that's a challenge that every owner has, is that they're dealing with their property. I want to move on to some of the issues that Casey and Katie talked about. And before I do that, again, Stephen, I want to thank you for a really great presentation. It really, opened my eyes to a lot of things. It's just very, very helpful. Far exceeded our expectations of what we'd learn about this morning.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
So Casey and Katie, there were a couple things that really, jumped out at me from your presentation as I am, sitting here with my existing building hat on. No surprise there. So two things particularly that you mentioned, in the, DC Clean Energy DC plan, and then also as it plays out then in the BEPS. So one is the notion of where are we going to get the carbon from? And there were two things that you mentioned, I think, that are particularly relevant. The first was the energy efficiency reduction, with 20% identified as coming from reducing the emissions from existing buildings. And then another, the 5% of generating green power, through local renewable energy. So clearly those two things directly link to the stewardship of the historic buildings and historic districts in the city. To what degree was any specific conversation about the contributions, in and about the historic districts part of the conversations of setting those goals?
Yeah, sorry, we're deciding who should answer the question. Since we're sitting next to each other. I mean, so when you're talking about clean energy DC, I'm actually not quite familiar with what conversations were had about historic buildings specifically. As I stated with the FAPT program, there was a lot of conversations about building age and the ability to do retrofits and the ability to do upgrades, and sort of, like I said, what the data has shown is that they don't perform any better or worse necessarily than newer buildings. In terms of setting the goals of the 10% solar carve-outs and the 20% reduction needed to be made in buildings, I think that that sort of came out of the overall modeling that our contractor did through the Clean Energy DC plan to say, this is what is reasonable to be able to do in that time frame across the city, right? And this is what is going to be needed to be done and what is reasonable and within reach to get to that 50% reduction. I don't know if you're going to answer that, Casey, at all.
I mean, I think also the key is, there was a sense, and I hopefully alluded to this earlier, that it's all on the table. It all, it's not a which policy or which lever does the district need to be pulling to advance our climate mitigation goals and needs, but it's all of them. And so, this is not your question, but I think we also found a parallel with affordable housing in that we weren't prepared to exempt affordable housing solely because there were some unique challenges in the financing and the regulation about advancing energy efficiency. And I think similar with historic properties, we didn't want to exempt them, or don't have the ability to exempt them from a climate standpoint. And so there's a huge opportunity with existing buildings, and I don't think it was targeted necessarily for historic properties. That I think that specific focus and specific opportunity really starts to manifest itself when we start thinking about embodied carbon. And again, I feel like that's the next frontier, but I feel like that's really where there's a unique aspect to the existing and historic building stock.
So, again, sitting here with my hat on, it sounds to me like, this is really something that, we through the DC Preservation League programming effort and so on could really contribute to. What's our understanding of what the kind of capacity of the historic districts are, to be able to contribute in various ways. Before I go to the embodied carbon, which I definitely want to come back to, I want to stay on the renewables for a minute. And I guess this is a question about Appendix Z, but it's certainly a question about kind of what is our understanding of zero net, carbon, zero net energy as we move forward. And really the question comes to the on-site and off-site renewables. And so what is the, is there recognition that we live in a world today where there's off-site renewable market? It's alive and well. And also, is there, what is DC's activities in really helping to become part of using our buyer power, if you will, to really try to advance, a clean grid that we have access to. I saw that was a really important part of, getting those goals met as well. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's an understanding that the larger the building, the harder it will be for them to be net zero energy fully on site. The I don't know what you want to call it, the geometry perhaps of a, the taller the building, the roof area stays the same, but if it's 10 stories, there's far less roof for generating solar energy on site. So at some point, there are various schools of thought around, what floor area ratio or height, after which it becomes near impossible to become net zero energy on site. So there's really an understanding that off-site renewable energy is always going to be an important piece and an important solution. Appendix Z, as you alluded to, is our working definition, and it attempts to put some barriers on that. There's a desire to, one, ensure that the building is as energy efficient as possible, and two, that we are generating on-site renewables wherever possible. But for a number of reasons, perhaps it's shading, that tree canopy goal is wonderful, but if the canopy is in the wrong place, it may impact the solar capacity of the building. So that's, there are trade-offs. Historic preservation may limit the ability to install solar panels depending on the visibility and the structure. So again, Appendix Z encourages on-site. I think it requires 5% on-site generation at a minimum, and then starts to put some boundaries on what can be procured off-site. It says from a tier 1 renewable, meaning solar or wind, within the DC, Maryland, Virginia region. For a few reasons, trying to minimize transmission losses and ensure new generation supporting the regional economy.
Yeah.
So that really does support trying to, encourage, regional renewables to be developed.
Yeah, and the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act, part of that legislation requires 100% renewable electricity from PEPCO by 2032. It's the most aggressive renewable portfolio standard in the country. And so the unique thing about the district is that when it comes to utilities, we operate like a state. And so we're able to pass legislation at the city level that can, require and compel our utilities to do things, whereas other states would have to go to the state level to do that. And so that's one sort of powerful piece of what we're able to do with our utilities, is require things through legislation, through our DC, through the council. Whereas, like I said, other jurisdictions would have to go to the state level to do that. And so that is another piece of like what we've done is sort of taking that out of the Clean Energy DC plan and codifying it and saying this, this is going to be required by 2032 by our electric utility. So that's another piece of what we've been able to do coming out of the CEDC plan.
And I will say, that has other impacts. The renewable portfolio standard sets a minimum of solar that needs to be generated within the district. That therefore means that there's value in the renewable energy credits, the sort of green certification of any solar panels within the district, which changes the economics for installing solar within DC. Every time your solar panel located within the district generates 1 megawatt of energy, you have earned 1 renewable energy credit, which can be traded on an open marketplace. The value of that SREC, solar renewable energy credit, is about $400 in the district. If you go across the border to Maryland, I actually don't know the spot. I mean, it's several orders of magnitude different.
Yes.
And that comes from the renewable portfolio requirements in the district. And so installing solar has amazing payback in the district. So hopefully there's now some market mechanisms in place that provide an opportunity for a revenue stream for folks to pay off in a 3-year period a solar array, and then generate not only clean electricity but also free electricity.
Right. And just like one more tidbit, from a BEPS perspective, having solar on your building actually can increase your Energy Star score, which helps the building get closer to that energy performance standard. Although it's not technically an efficiency measure, it's essentially acts as such within Portfolio Manager, because as you can imagine, you don't have that loss in distribution and transmission. So the production and the delivery of electricity to that building is much more efficient than if you were getting it from offsite. So it can help increase a building's Energy Star score as well, to help them get closer to the energy performance standard.
So I have a couple specific questions about the BEPS program. The first is, you talked about the potential fines aspect of that. And so, 100,000 square foot building, that's $1 million fine. What's the term of that fine? Every 5 years, every 5 minutes, every year?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite clarified that. That's the end of the compliance cycle. So you get to the end of the 5 years. And if the building hasn't met their energy efficiency requirements based on the pathway they've chosen, they have the potential maximum penalty of $10 per square foot. So it's over a 5-year period.
Thank you. And then the second question that I had about the BEPS program is that right now its applicability is for buildings 50,000 square feet or larger.
Yes.
Is there a thought that in the future that number will drop and smaller buildings will need to comply and will be subject to the BEPS program?
Yeah, I actually took this slide out of my presentation, but I should have left it in. So every BEPS period, which is that every 6-year period, we set the standard. It will drop down in square footage for the first 3 periods. So right now it applies to buildings 50,000 square feet and above. Starting in 2027, it'll drop down to 25,000 square foot and above. And then starting in 2033, I believe, yes, I'm doing the math right, it'll drop down to 10,000 square feet and above on the private side. That entire time, DC-owned buildings over 10,000 have to comply. But on the private side, it's 50, then down to 25, and then down to 10.
So that's pretty similar to what happened with the Green Building Act application as well. So makes sense.
Yeah. And just to give you a sense of how many buildings that is, right now it's about 2,000 buildings. When we drop down to 10,000 square feet, it'll be more around 6,000 or 7,000 buildings.
Great, thank you. And my last question, I think, could end up being a good segue to asking a couple more questions of Amania. I'm particularly interested in the prescriptive path and the performance path. And I can just tell you that from my own work as an architect, the performance path was one that we used to prefer because we could sort of, use the approaches that made the most sense for the project. And then, here's the evidence that we're showing that we're meeting these performance goals. And, so it just gives us the ability to have some flexibility and really show the evidence of where we're hoping to get with a project. But for a lot of owners, frankly, the prescriptive method takes less analysis, so, okay, just fine, give me the list, I'll do the list. Was there any effort in developing the prescriptive path that exists today to really try to understand it in the context of the predominant building types in Washington, and specifically the predominant heritage building types in Washington?
Great question. So when we originally set out to build out the prescriptive pathway, what we were planning to do, and we had talked to stakeholders about, was having sort of a menu of options of energy conservation measures, or ECMs, as we call them, that the building owner could choose from. And it would say, okay, if I do ECM number 1, that essentially is modeled out to get my office building a 10% savings, right? If I do ECM number 2, that is modeled out to get my building a 5% savings. And you had to go down the line and essentially check off that list and make sure that it was adding up to at least 20% savings, right? Modeled. That was sort of the original intent, was like, we literally have a list of energy conservation measures and what the modeled savings would be by property type. And we had talked about, is there, when we do that modeling, should we look at historic buildings and talk about whether there should be a different savings percentage based on the building being historic. It turns out that is really, really, really complicated to do. And it takes a lot of time that we did not have to do. And we didn't quite have the data set that we wanted to be able to do that. So the way our prescriptive pathway is built out now is, again, it's more action-based. And what we're requiring is that the building get an energy audit. They have to get a level 2 ASHRAE energy audit. And then the energy auditor has to identify what measures would get what savings in that building. So it will be much more building specific. So the auditor will be identifying the ECMs and then telling DOEE what savings would be achieved in that building. Obviously, DOE will have to verify that data. So that's what we'll be doing, is looking at that and ensuring that it makes sense and verifying it. And then the building owner will be required to take a lot of other steps. So they're going to have to start off with energy audits, identifying the measures, identifying what sort of points each measure will get you in the building, to sort of make sure that the prescriptive pathway is not a loophole from the performance pathway. We are requiring that building owners, that auditors and the building owner identify measures that would actually add up to a 25% savings based on modeling. Because as we know, models are not always 100% accurate. So we are requiring that building owners identify measures to implement that add up to at least 25% savings, with the aim that that would actually get a 20% savings in reality, right? And so then they have to energy audit, create an action plan. They have to implement that action plan, and then they have to verify it with DOEE. Along the way, they also have to create an operations and maintenance program, and they have to verify that they have implemented that O&M program in the building. So that's sort of how our prescriptive pathway works. And as I stated, we're making it very building specific by having the auditor actually identify the ECMs and what savings are potentially coming from those ECMs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And actually, it really, as you were saying, it sort of gets you to understanding building specific performance anyhow.
Yes. Yeah, and then the thought is, if we do it this way and we collect all the data, maybe in the future we could have a menu of options, more a la, let me check this box and I know that this ECM will get me about 12% savings. So maybe through this first compliance cycle, we could collect enough data to be able to do that. But right now, that's how we've structured the prescriptive pathway.
So Amani, you want to add anything to that? Any more perspective on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about how it's always a little difficult for folks to know their building. And so not even from just the historic building, but if we were able to have surveys of historic building types that are in whatever the level of energy savings is needed for that property, how great of an asset that would be to not only our office, but to other historic areas. Because right now, you kind of do one survey of a building maybe 10, 20 years ago, and then there's really no follow-up from a historic preservation standpoint on the efficacy and the integrity of a building. So having an auditor coming into a building and having a line underneath that says, okay, identify the building's age, material, and just additional questions would be a great survey for us to get back from from DOEV, so that we could also have a way to document what the energy efficiency and audits are getting from these historic buildings. And so I think that it's a great plan in really highlighting the importance of collaborations between both these agencies, because with them doing this work, it allows us to have an opportunity to go out and explore historic buildings in a different manner, not just to document, but also to get some more additional savings information too. And so definitely would be a great asset.
Yeah, I agree, Amani. And like, we'll be, anybody who follows the prescriptive pathway will be collecting all of that audit data. And we can tag properties as historic and, be able to do that essentially with our program. As long as those buildings are following the prescriptive pathway, we'll have that data, and we can do that sort of data matching and see across the board what that looks like.
Or even doing it by historic districts. And so going into a historic district, picking out the contributing buildings, sending auditors there to those buildings, evaluating them, would really provide you guys with the information you need, and especially for our office. And so that we have a great documentation, not only of where these existing buildings are in our current state, how they are performing now, and then also give you guys the information that you need.
Absolutely.
So I've got one embodied carbon question that I think maybe goes to everybody, which is, has the term avoided carbon been any part of this conversation? And so what I mean by that is, in the historic preservation world, in the building reuse world writ large, as we look at building retrofit scenarios versus building replacement scenarios, the avoided embodied carbon from doing a retrofit scenario is very substantial. It's also something that is essentially impossible to monetize. There's no system in place to monetize that avoided carbon. What can we do to help bring that dimension of embodied carbon into your conversation?
Well, I think, by definition, the avoided term necessitates a baseline. How much are we avoiding? What are we comparing it to? And I feel like I see interesting parallels in the embodied carbon conversation to energy benchmarking and now BEPS. I think there's a natural progression that starts with collecting the data and amassing that real treasure trove of data to then begin to inform what the building stock looks like in the district, to then be able to say, compared to what, okay, so you've reduced your embodied carbon content, perhaps by reusing, perhaps by using some innovative concrete, whatever it may be. What is that compared to? Reducing it from what? So, real basics beginning is, I think that collecting disclosure data is a great place to start. And I think that data would certainly set apart new construction versus reuse pretty quickly. And then, the bigger next step is to put a value on that. And, I think that's a much bigger question. But if you were able to put a value on carbon, certainly that could create a value stream for those who are reducing it. But that's a tougher nut to crack.
Yeah. Amani, you have anything to add to that?
No, only to associate it most likely with a different value. So if it's difficult to monetize the carbon, then maybe looking at the mitigation strategy as the way to add the value to it. And so that would be my only thought on how to just relocate the idea of where the money is coming. If it's not going to come from, you can't monetize one thing, then let's say if you do something, that's going to give you the money thing for it. So that's my only thought on it.
Okay, well, thank you. A couple quick questions from the historic preservation perspective. One, and this is particularly relevant to me as we're really talking about what's going to happen over the next 20 years and the emergence of the kind of modern era building stock into the historic preservation circle. And then, oh, by the way, those buildings are extremely important in terms of, building energy conservation, performance and eliminating carbon. What's the sort of emerging conversation about modern era preservation in the district?
For me, right now, the conversation for modern, now are you asking about the modern now that we've reached 50 years for these modern buildings, how are we bringing in those buildings into the conversation? We haven't had those conversations in the office yet. I think one of the biggest thing is surveying, documenting what we have and where those buildings are as far as assessing them and their integrity. So we've assessed buildings previously based off of different criteria on older buildings, whether it be wood siding, whether it be windows, whether it be structure and framing. For the modern buildings, you have a different set. And so I think we just haven't had the ability to really go down and identify what those character defining features are, what are we preserving, and how are we going to make sure that people understand what that means and what the significance of them are. Right now, I think it's great that we are at a time when we're educating and we're talking about and going through different internal preservation groups about it, but I don't think the larger community still sees these modern buildings as historically significant yet. And so I think by first establishing what those identifying features are and then really saying that they're significant and identifying that significance is where we would start. But the conversation has to start with survey and document, and we just haven't even gotten there yet. Well, at least in the city, from a city planning standpoint, we are moving towards it, but not yet.
Yeah, I raised the topic. It's something that we're going to talk about in future programming, but I don't know the specific numbers for DC well, but I know them for other cities that, that modern era building stock is oftentimes something like 5% of the building stock, but 50% of the emissions footprint. So it tends to be a very, very high target for really looking at, deep energy retrofits, et cetera. The one other question that I wanted to ask is that I was actually very impressed and just, really excited to hear, Rogelio's presentation at the beginning of kind of setting this context of a community being aware of itself and aware of its challenges and aware of where the equity issues are, aware of the big challenges with things like affordable housing and just, housing stock itself. I'm so impressed with what a self-aware, fully awake city DC is, and with really ambitious goals and really impressively balanced and equitable goals and so on. How has the historic preservation world been part of really helping to understand what the conditions are in DC, and how the heritage building stock really has an opportunity to play in being part of the affordable housing solution, being part of the equity and racial justice solution in the city?
Great that you brought that up, because as you know, we have we have Anacostia Historic District, and then we have Berry Farms Historic District. And then that's the only historic districts in Ward 8. Then we would talk about Ward 4, which also has just a limited amount of historic districts within it. So it's important for us to know that what we currently have as these are our historic buildings. It's not limited to what's already just been inventoried. There is a vast amount of older buildings that have not been surveyed and that have not been put into that significant category. And the community doesn't know that that is an option for them to look at for development, for community engagement, for preservation. It allows for a lot larger conversation to expand within a community. And so right now it is important for our organization, our office, to really be involved in these small area plans. And these plans that are localized within communities, so that these areas that are currently getting developed that do not have any historic districts within them at all really understand what the benefits are, not just of preservation from a architectural standpoint, but also knowing that preservation is a socially and culturally ability to perform at your best neighborhood, as your best community. And that is where we're driving our, we're helping our constituents, our OP team, to really get involved in what we do, which is identification, documentation, and promoting historic preservation throughout the DC area. And so I brought up the fact that I recently did an Anacostia woodworking shop for windows. And when I say, for an area that has a lot of stock of old existing buildings, they had no idea how to maintain those historic windows. And they also didn't know about the energy savings that you can get by just weather stripping. They didn't know what weather stripping was. And so that information is something that our office should be able to be providing to the community. That is the type of information that would not only lift up preservation, but it lifts up sustainability as well as resiliency. And so those are the conversations about bringing equity in not just one area, but throughout the DC area.
Well, the clock on the wall, as if any of us still have clocks on the wall, says it's time to wrap it up. And I want to do that by thanking Stephen and Katie and Casey and Amania, and also Rogelio, who's not with us at the moment anymore, for really terrific presentations. I learned a lot. It really came together as a really great overview of where our city stands and what it's doing with this rapidly emerging topic of we need to decarbonize. It's not an option. We need to get busy on it. And from the preservation perspective, really coming away with an understanding that there really is an awareness of that it's time for us to get out of our silos and really work together. And we have a holistic, problem to solve, and we have to do it holistically by working together. So thank you again for a terrific morning. I think all the attendees really, got a rare opportunity to just be part of a really terrific program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rebecca to take us out.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you to all of our speakers today and our attendees. I think it was a great conversation and a great program too. Our next program is December 8th, and it will be case studies on retrofits here in Washington. So I think that'll be an interesting program as well. So with that, I will wish you all a great afternoon, and thank you all for spending your morning with us.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Appreciate
everybody.
it.
This is great.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks again.